conference at the University of Birmingham over the summer will have heard Nina talking on Watt and musical instruments. This was quite a challenge because Watt was notoriously, as I recall, tone deaf, isn't that right?
Supposedly.
And yet he had a business making musical instruments as one of the many sidelines. That was a particularly compelling and dramatic and delightful lecture. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Nina talk. Nina has had a varied career. I'm delighted to say she was a Merchant Navy deck officer on leaving school, yet another one of us that have been in the clutches of the Merchant Navy for a while. She took an engineering design degree in her 30s from the University of Warwick, and then gained a PhD in concrete durability from the University of Liverpool, which will definitely appeal to the civil engineers in the audience. In fact, you might even get questions about that. She's lived with her family in Glasgow since 1989 and worked variously as a materials lecturer in further education, a research administrator, and until 2017 as an elected city councillor. She suggests timidly that she's retired, but her interest in promoting STEM careers for girls has led her to become an independent researcher, mainly specialising in the history of women in engineering. I know she's got all sorts of fascinating material because we've corresponded already. Nina, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, this is not going to be anything like as organised a dissertation as the talk I gave about James Watt. This is, the minutes have me down as the AGM will be flowed by Nina. Well, this is not going to be very flowish. This is going to be more bits and bobs of this and that, because there's so many stories I would love to tell. Some of these individuals, I could talk all evening just on one of them. But in order to give you a flavour of some of the people who I think are definitely worth their names and activities being better known, I've called it From Airships to the Space Race, and the nearer we get to the modern times, the more dodging about between fields that there will be. There will be no concrete to speak of. Most of the women I'm going to be talking about, not all, but most, are those who have been connected with the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough and its predecessors and descendant organisations. There will be some familiar names possibly, and I hope that most of you will learn of somebody that you either didn't know about or you didn't know some aspect of their background. So I found this rather charming picture, A Trip to the Moon, which is actually, it's a piece of sheet music, it's a music hall song. I think from from browsing around in the aviation galleries here this afternoon while I was killing time before the meeting, my feeling is this is sort of broadly of the French style of airships. And here we are off to the moon in an airship, and I'm glad to say everybody is wearing super hats. Anybody who knows me well will know I love a good hat. So everybody should wear their hats when they're in an airship on the way to the moon. And starting off, indeed, with airships. The very first women to be employed in any kind of technical capacity by what became the Royal Aircraft Establishment were the Vineling family. There were men, pretty useless lot of men on the whole, one way and another, and the women held the whole thing together as time went on. This is Madeline Vineling from much later on in the story, but to begin with, her mother and father. Her father, Casimir Vineling, who had other names, Frederick as well, and Casimir is spelt in a variety of ways, were the saviour of the sort of early days of the change from hot air ballooning to lighter than air gas ballooning and the use of hydrogen. When the Royal Engineers found how useful balloons were for surveillance purposes, spying. It was decided that they would start a balloon school and a balloon factory. Initially at Woolwich Arsenal, then at Chatham, but ultimately it came to roost on the land at Farnborough, which the Royal Aircraft Establishment ultimately started to inhabit and spread all over. To begin with, they were largely a factory. They were the Royal Balloon Factory and School. But once they started to use hydrogen, what with it being the smallest molecule available, they had great trouble containing it in anything because there wasn't a fabric both light enough and impermeable enough to hold on to it. Until, more or less by chance, Colonel Templar, who was not actually a colonel but styled himself as such and dressed as such, and there's a nice picture of him down in the museum in the airship bit of the gallery. He happened to see at the Great Exhibition a shopkeeper called Heron, who ran a shop selling, they were called toys, but they were scientific knickknacks, basically really for adults. Toys meant different things in those days, amongst which were little tiny hydrogen balloon kits. And so Templar was very intrigued as to how Mr. Heron's balloons operated, and asked to see what the material behind this was. And Heron introduced him to the Vineling family. Now the Vinelings were originally from Alsace, which is why if you delve into their history you get into a morass of whether they were French or German, because the border did what it did. And this picture on the right is taken from an advertisement for Casimir's family firm, the Vinelings, who made globes and things of that kind, but they were inflatable globes specially designed for the explorer to take in his bite. And they had patents in Alsace for the product which underlies all this. And the product, for those of you who've had your tea, is cowgut, otherwise known as goldbeater skin. And for the first of my props, you can come have a feel of this afterwards, but this is a small piece of goldbeater skin for you to look at later. Goldbeater skin was something that had been known from medieval times, and it was a product that was made into books which would be interleaved with gold leaf for gilders to use. Here we see Vineling women working at a very early period, because they're not using sort of any formal equipment, they're using the backs of kitchen chairs to stretch these pieces of cowgut. So basically you take what's known as the caecum, which is like the appendix bit of a cowgut, and it's cleaned out with alkaline, and then it can be preserved, and when dry it's like that. It's kind of like really thin parchment, but when it's wet it kind of behaves like cling film in that it's stretchy and it sticks to itself, and it's the sticking to itself thing that makes it so perfect for airship work, because not only is it not woven, so there are no awkward little holes for the hydrogen to get out of, but you don't need to sew it and make more holes, because you can just stick one damp bit to another damp bit. You know, like when you're fighting with that bit of cling film that you want to stretch over the bowl and it's stuck to itself and you've got this tangled mess. Well, what these ladies are doing here, they are working with prepared pieces of this stuff, making them ready to be put together. Now you can see, more or less, that what they're working with isn't very big. And this next picture shows you, it's a bit clearer in some ways. The bottom right-hand picture is actually from the First World War, of women working almost certainly in the Beardmore Airship Works, Where is that now? Possibly short, I can't remember where that one's from, but you can see they're working these relatively small pieces. To make a decent sized airship, you need 250,000 dead cows. And to make anything really big, now a good sized Hindenburg, you need 750,000. So, although we ate more meat in those days, we didn't eat that much. And most of our supplies of this stuff came salted down in barrels from the Chicago stockyards. And in the top picture you see one of the Windling women who is instructing a Royal Engineer soldier in the use and preparation of this stuff. And that's because in the Boer War, the Royal Balloon Factory was dead busy. I mean, there would have been a lot of semi-skilled and unskilled women working under the supervision of the Windling mother and daughters to produce the wherewithal to make the gas envelopes for the balloons for the First World War. They made these gas envelopes. These were boxed up in tins, which were sent out by ship with the cloth outer envelope with the soldiers en masse to South Africa. With small repair kits, and my guess is this soldier is being taught the basics of how to do field repairs. Larger repairs were sent back by sea for the women to work on, and delightfully, from my point of view as a researcher, the accounts for some of this are in the National Archives, so we can see how much money was being set aside to do this kind of work. But at that point, the Farnborough was the Royal Balloon Factory. Come the First World War, and airships were still being used, and this picture at the top left, it's a bit pale, so I hope those of you further away can actually see it. It's a really lovely painting by a chap called Sir Russell Flint, Sir William Russell Flint, who was, both before and after the First World War, a very well-known painter of rather florid, sort of pre-Raphaelite things. But during the war, he was commissioned into the Navy, and he became an Assistant Admiralty Airship Inspector, mostly at Beardmore's works down the Air in Chinnan. Now, I am hoping that somebody can put me right. The picture in the top right-hand corner I only found just this week when putting this together. It's another one of his paintings of an airship in a shed. I'm assuming that it's at Inchinnan, but I don't know enough about airships and sheds to be sure where it is. It could have been one of the ones he was at down south. It is said in his biography that he commanded His Majesty's Airship 24. I cannot find any other record of an airship of that number, but you know, there were lots and lots of airships of different classes, so I have to take that at face value, pending any other information. And he did this lovely picture of women sewing, well, putting together. We can't tell if they're sewing or if they're working with the gold beater skin. But that is almost certainly at Beardmore's. The picture at the bottom right is of women patching the gas envelope of the R100. And you can get some feel for the translucentness, and that would be several layers of overlap gold beater skin going in different directions, I guess. And they're wearing slippers, and they're in sort of quasi-naval uniform. I don't know if they would have been in the Wrens, or the Wrens was gone by then, but perhaps left over sort of traditional naval connections with airships. But they're patching it up. The technology for gas envelopes didn't really catch up until about the 1920s, and the last record we have of the Windling women is in about 1923. They had been the forewomen of the envelope shop, and they would have had hundreds of women under them and other assistant forewomen and so on. Casimir got himself into various bits of problem fighting and drinking. One of the brothers had some kind of mental health issues. So basically, these women were the first technical people with their exceptional skills in handling this awkward stuff at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Sticking with airships, we now come to one of my favourite ladies ever, Hilda Margaret Lyon, Yorkshire woman, for those of you from Yorkshire, and also to cheer those of you up from Yorkshire. I would say that in my database, the county, the 3 ridings of Yorkshire are overrepresented in terms of interesting women of the past in engineering. Hilda Lyon was from a small town near Beverley in East Yorkshire, where her family were successful grocers, and she stood out completely, both in the place and the family, from an early age, in that, as was described, this is a story handed down by a relative to her great-niece. At school, Hilda had her hand up with the answer before the rest of us realised the teacher had even asked the question. So she was sent off to the local grammar school and then went to Cambridge and got a maths degree. She worked initially as the sole structural engineering analyst for initially Siddeley Deasy's and then George Parnell's, at a time when they were running out a whole load of different aeroplanes practically on a daily basis. There was a chief designer doing the design, she was doing all the maths. However, as you will see, there is an airship in the picture, and I should say before we go any further, this very nice painting of her was done by the mayor of her hometown when we went there last year, and it has a submarine, an aeroplane and an airship in it. We'll see why. We see here in the other picture the construction of the R101 at Cardington, which was her first job with the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She was sent to do structural analysis on the transverse framing, and indeed transverse framing became something of a speciality for her in aeroplanes as well. She went to MIT to do a master's and was away for a couple of years. And her master's was on the effect of turbulence on the drag of airship models, because it was becoming apparent that you couldn't get reliable results on the same model in different wind tunnels. And her research was to look at the turbulence that was caused by the fans and the interference with wires, suspending models and so on, and the need for baffles. But one of the outcomes of this, which clear in this next picture, she looked at the drag coefficients of different airships. Now, it had previously been thought that streamlining meant having things very pointy at the front as well as pointy at the back. And she realised that actually this wasn't the case, and that having quite a bluff front and a pointy back was as good. And you will excuse me if I read to you from what is, I think, apart from maths that I don't understand, a commendably clear bit of thesis writing. With this assumption, 2 ships of the same volume and the same fineness ratio will have the same drag. In considering the speed and required horsepower, there is therefore nothing to choose between the 2 ships. From the structural point of view, the shape with the higher block coefficient has a definite advantage, as it provides a greater gas volume in the nose and tail to balance the concentrated weights of the mooring equipment and the fins, thus relieving the static bending moments on the hull and reducing the structural weight. As the structural weight in modern rigid airships is about 65% of the total available lift, a saving of 10% on the structure weight means an increase of nearly 20% in the useful load and probably 65% in the payload. So a lot of the talks I give, I then have to explain block coefficients. In this room, I don't have to get into any of that because you've all understood that she found that having a rounded nose made no difference to the drag, and therefore you could have a more effective airship. On the basis of her work there, she then went to Göttingen, which was the preeminent aerodynamic centre of the world, and was functionally more or less like the Royal Aircraft Establishment was to become. And she worked for about 18 months for this gentleman, Professor Ludwig Prandtl, who was the top man. I only discovered quite recently that not only was he the top man in her field, he was also an unusually early supporter of women's technical careers, and he had quite a number of women research assistants working for him at this very interesting period in the early 30s. Now, it was a pretty alarming period for Hilda because she was there as Hitler was coming to power. She was there during the period when many of the Jewish lecturers and students had to leave. Prandtl, although not actually a member of the Nazis, was a supporter and remained in place, and it may explain why ultimately he didn't come to Britain after the war. But she worked for him until, unfortunately, her mother fell ill, and despite the fact that there was a brother and a brother's wife at home in Yorkshire, she, as the daughter, was expected to go home and look after the dying mum. Now, for most of us today, domestic responsibilities taking you away into a career break from your technical employment is hard enough. Astonishingly, her colleagues in Britain recognised her talents while she was on what we would call a domestic career break, and fed her bits of work that she could do largely from home so that she could keep going. She actually published 4 papers during this period. And it wasn't until 1937, after her mother had died, and the Royal Aircraft Establishment was sort of increasing the number of people for the upcoming war that everybody knew was on its way, that they were able to generate a job for her. And so in 1937, she went to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, where she remained for the rest of her life. One of the things that she did, this was almost just the year she died, in fact. In 1945, she was sent with many others on the sort of scavenging trip. I think this was part of Operation Surgeon, but there were others in different fields of engineering. But they went to Göttingen and to Wolkenrode. They interviewed people, they looked at papers that had been written, they looked at equipment, they boxed up everything conceivable. Nearly all the post-war wind tunnels at Farnborough had come from these places, and they looked at what different people were doing to see who they might recruit. And we'll come back to some of this, but on the right there's a picture out of this report. It says, report on a visit to Wolkenrode and Göttingen, September 28th to October 15th, 1945, by H.M. Lyon. And the picture on the right is to do with swing-wing aeroplane research, and we will see more of that in due course. At the very end of her life, and indeed it was actually published posthumously, the theoretical analysis of longitudinal dynamic stability in gliding flight. And for those of you like myself who are not necessarily aeronautical engineers or aerodynamicists, the graph at the bottom from this report of some of her research is the effect of weight moment on phugoid damping. Now, phugoid motion in an aeroplane is a kind of a problem for pilots, in that they get to the point where they kind of get into a sort of repeated wave behaviour like this, where it's like going up a hill, you slow down, and then you come down and you speed up, and you go. and it's a real problem. Nowadays, there's a lot of software in place based on some of this early research, anti-fugoid software, to step in and overcome it automatically. And it's one of the things that is thought to have been contributory to the crash, and I've forgotten the guy's name, but there was a plane crash a number of years ago where the pilot managed to overcome the software and land in the Potomac River safely. Everybody walked away. But we've had 2 more recent crashes where we've not found the aeroplane, the Malaysian and so on aircraft, and it's thought that this might have been the problem, and then now, of course, Boeing in a shed load of trouble about the software, and the software is to do with this fugoid damping that she worked on. You will remember that I was speaking about her work at MIT on the shape of airships. In America, but not here, that shape of a round front and a pointy back is known as the Lyons shape after her research, and was applied to particular classes of submarines. This is the Albacore, USS Albacore, which is a museum now, of that class that used the Lyons shape. And when submarines were new, in America, trainee submarine officers were sent to train in airship flying first to get a feel for how things behave in 3 dimensions, and of course similar shapes. And the bottom picture is a plaque on the wall of the building, her father's old shop, where she was born and raised in the flat above it, in a place called Market Wheaton, near Beverley in Yorkshire, which I'm thrilled to say that last summer, myself working with local residents, the mayor, and local remaining relatives and relatives from overseas, got this plaque put up on the wall of the shop. So if you happen to be in that part of Yorkshire, go and pay your respects to Miss Lyon. Now, I can't talk about the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the women who worked there without mentioning Beatrice Schilling and the work that she did on the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. I'm sure most people in this room, in fact, even the general public now, if you ask them to name an engineer, there is a fair chance that they may have heard of Beatrice Schilling and the work that she did on the Merlin engines. The problem was the problem of negative gravity, what happens when this particular engine with its particular type of carburettor was in a dive and in a negative gravity situation, whereby the carburettor float valve allowed it to flood, the engine to cut out, and then you couldn't get it started again and the thing crashed. Now, this job was given to Beatrice Schilling, and she sorted it out. And I should tell you how she came to be there in the first place. She is one of the great successes of the Women's Engineering Society. In 1919, when it was founded after the First World War, a number of women who wanted engineering careers were finding it very difficult in that period. And some of them set up their own companies, one of whom was a woman called Margaret Partridge. Margaret Partridge was basically a builder of small DC power stations and an electrical contractor who went round the southwest of England convincing large homeowners and small villages that they would really like to have electric light. And would they like to all club together and pay her to build them a small coal-fired power station and wire them all up for electric light. Her practice was to employ a bright young lass, somebody who was reasonably practical and good at maths, as an apprentice, and the apprenticeship would be to build the power station, connect up all the houses, and be left behind to run it. A number of girls did indeed train in this way, and Beatrice Schilling was the standout lassie. To such an extent that the Women's Engineering Society touted round to try and find her various bits and bobs of funding so that she could go to Manchester College of Technology and take a degree, an associateship in engineering. And she then went to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, where she had a lifelong career as somebody with an expertise in engines, motors and fuels, which is why she was given the Merlin engine to look at and sort out. And famously, she introduced this RA restrictor, which is something sort of somewhere between a funnel and a washer. This was a stopgap to hold the fort pending Rolls-Royce doing a more permanent solution. So in 1941, she motorbiked on the bike that she had actually won the Gold Star at Brooklands racecourse on. She motored around RAF stations, training technicians how to do it, pending the permanent solution, which was ultimately replaced. The old SU carburettor was replaced by a Bendix one or Rolls-Royce's own pressurised carburettor in due course. However, in 1943, I found a flight crash report. So even though all the engines were meant to have been retrofitted with these restrictors in 1941, there were still planes around that hadn't been, and a Polish pilot who was training on the Spitfire managed to have the engine cut out, and he brought the plane down satisfactorily, but unfortunately the field he had to land in was, well, we can associate with this after the weather we've had, it was very waterlogged, so the wheels just went squodge, and the gun underneath caught and flipped him over. Now he was fine, plane not so much so, but he wasn't blamed because this plane hadn't had this Royal Aircraft Establishment restrictor fitted. You will see it referred to as variously Miss Shilling's orifice and Tilly's orifice. I'm here to tell you she was never ever known as Tilly. I have nobody knows where that's come from, but she was never known as that. And she was a pretty tough character who, my guess is that nicknames would not have been quite her thing. But that's what she has become to be well known about. But we will return to her in a minute. So now we are bridging the period between the Second World War and the Cold War. And the women we see here are ATS women who were probably women who had trained in army radar, tracking radar, anti-aircraft radar, that kind of thing, because these were women who were expert in tracking and analysing the behaviour of missiles. And the picture on the right is a testing ground in Wales, where Operation Backfire tested some of the things that had been half-inched from Peenemünde and the like, namely V2 rockets and their descendants. And they were testing them, and these women were employed to do the tracking and analysis. And in a sense, that's a sort of repeat story that we'll see coming up again. And as we move through the Cold War and towards the end of the talk into the space race, I've been hard put to divide these up because this stuff goes backwards and forwards, and if you have some time to go and look at the early part of the rocket display on the ground floor of the Science Museum, a number of the rockets that I'm going to be mentioning, you can see the real McCoy there. So here we are, back with Miss Shilling. And I should mention that Beatrice Schilling was living and working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment as a civil servant at a time of the marriage bar, when it was a requirement that women in the civil service who married had to leave. She married twice and didn't leave. And basically it was not quite don't ask, don't tell, because in both cases she was married to colleagues, but it was a question of how can we get around this without getting into trouble with the Treasury, and they designated her as temporary, and then that was okay. She got promotion, she ended up relatively senior. So this is what she started to work on next. This was, she was in charge of the RAE's transonic rocket engine unit. And this is some pictures of how they tested these model rockets. They strapped them to the bottom of a mosquito, sent it up to fly, and then launched it. So it's a bit like the shuttle in a way, isn't it? You know, you send it up on the back of something else and then let it go. However, miraculously, they didn't actually kill anybody because these things blew up at the slightest or no provocation at all. They were quite small, as you can see from the picture of it in comparison to the mosquito. And we have the top right, the whole model rocket, and then bottom left, the engine and igniter bits, and the same on the right-hand side. These were basically bombs. To call them rockets is quite complimentary, because when we say igniter, you were igniting something incredibly dangerous and hoping to God it went in the wrong direction. Very often it did not. And the picture at the top right is what resulted. Now the first tests, like the one on the left, model test over the Scillies, a lot of the first tests were done over the open ocean off Cornwall and the Scillies. So naturally, when they'd blown things up, there was nothing left to find because it was all at the bottom of the sea. So they then started doing it on land in low pressure chambers, and they still managed to blow an awful lot of stuff up. The team was working on these ramjets, and to test the ramjets, they had jet test vehicles of various kinds, and they blew a number of them up too. Eventually, they got to the point, this top left-hand picture of number 8, JTV Mark 8, before they actually managed to launch it in such a way that you could call it a rocket and not a bomb. The direct descendants of that ramjet work were the early Bloodhound ground-to-air missiles. Now, the Bloodhound ultimately became a really, really successful story because through various versions, it was still in use up into the 1990s, but it started in this post-war, Cold War rocket development era, and it was something that Beatrice Schilling had a really big hand in designing the very early little tiny model motors that were the beginnings of that. Now, not all the women working in this kind of work were necessarily at the RAE. On the left is Joan Lavender, who worked initially, well, it went through all the names you might be familiar with, de Havilland, Hawke Siddeley, British Aerospace. And she worked on the Excalibur guided artillery shell, and was the manager in charge of the computer-aided design and manufacture in its very, very earliest days for BAE's General Weapons, Guided Weapons Division. So we're talking about, you know, the 60s and 70s. And she also worked on some of the work that they were asked to do on the Blue Streak rocket, another thing you can see mentioned in the museum. The woman on the right, Peggy Hodges, who additionally was one of the presidents of the Women's Engineering Society. She worked for GEC, where she was project manager of their guided weapons department, and she worked on the Red Dean, which is the bottom picture, and the Sea Dart, which is the top picture. There are quite a lot of women working in this kind of field, and it's interesting how even today women are disproportionately represented in aerospace and defence engineering over and above the other older fields of engineering. I like to think that those two fields didn't have so much cultural baggage with them, and so somehow or other it's been easier for women to enter from the very beginning and still find good careers in those industries. So here we are at Woomera, which is where Britain launched practically everything it's ever launched under its own aegises before it got involved with the European Space Agency and the like. Here we have the Black Knight on the launch pad at Woomera. Now these women in the bottom right-hand corner, these were the British and Australian computers. As in NASA, where they had women computers, so we did too. And this group of women at Woomera were led by Mary Whitehead, who's the one marked with the red arrow. And they did the photo tracking, they did the analysis, and they did the maths from which new designs would derive. You'll see them in uniform there. That's because in the early days, although they were civilian, because of the nature of the place, they lived in barracks and they wore army-type uniforms. And the women at the top are operating the photographic tracking of these things. So the Black Knight was a launch vehicle which was used to test re-entry vehicles for the Blue Streak. Here we have the Blue Streak, also at Woomera. The Blue Streak was variously a test for our potential, but then not, space program, but ultimately it became part of the missiles program. The Black Arrow, also downstairs in the museum, was a satellite launch vehicle which was derived from a combination of what was discovered from the work done with Blue Streak and Black Knight we saw before. So Black Arrow was the baby of Blue Streak and Black Knight. And the picture in the middle is the boil-off test rig which Beatrice built at the Royal Aircraft Establishment to do tests on the oxygen tank for the Blue Streak. And I think that this bit here is this bit here, but I'm not a rocket person, so you can put me right. But they look as though those are the same bits. But the picture, the black and white picture in the middle, is at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. And the picture bottom right is of her high altitude test plant, which again she built and ran, and this is a posed PR photo of her notionally taking tests. Excuse me. But not everything to do with getting rockets into space is to do with actual rockets. And a number of women at the Royal Aircraft Establishment worked on other aspects of what it means to fly high and fast. And a number of them worked on the development of pressure suits and the equipment that enables initially ordinary fighter pilots to go hard and fast in a non-pressurised cabin. This woman, Helen Grimshaw, another woman who had a lifetime career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in various fields, not just in what came to be variously aerospace, medicine or human factors. And here she is at her retirement being presented with a little model of this spacesuit, which was known as the Haldane spacesuit, but she had a huge part in designing and testing this spacesuit as developed from the early pressure suits. There is a wonderful American book about the development of spacesuits, and when you see some of the early ones, they are absolutely jaw-dropping how peculiar they were, and very uncomfortable and all the rest of it to wear. Another woman in a similar line of work was Kate Maslin. She did also a lot of work on spacesuits, oh, perhaps I should go back one, actually. I'll go back to Helen. Because she not only did this, and there's a really nice, here we go, there are no names on these, but this is an Air Ministry pamphlet from 1944 called Oxygen Sense, which is trying to persuade pilots not to be macho and leave their oxygen masks off. So you can have a look at that afterwards. I think almost certainly if she didn't write it, a lot of her research went into that. She also wrote a massive 9-part manual on all the aspects of testing, flying and towing troop-carrying glider tugs, which were used at the latter end of the war to drop troops into Europe. But the end of her career, the last 8 years of her career was spent in this kind of work. She retired in 1961. Carrying on to Kate. As well as assisting Helen Grimshaw on suits and also on helmet and oxygen design, Kate Maslin was an expert in the effects of noise and vibration on human performance. And when you see some of those early films of what it was like to be launched in the early space capsules, you'll see why that was so important. She did work on what was needed to control the circulation of carbon dioxide in a space capsule. All of this at a time when, you know, we really only heard about the astronauts and the cosmonauts. We never really heard an awful lot about the backroom people. But without it, none of those dogs, monkeys, men would have been going anywhere. And although I'm not really talking about anybody outside Britain, I thought I'd just put this picture in to remind everybody that engineering isn't only about metal and concrete and stone, and that textiles are important too. The woman on the left is actually sewing software for the early Apollo missions. The software, the programming consisted of wires woven in and out of that perforated block. And the woman on the right, more recently, she's working on the thermal blankets, the heat shielding for the modern re-entry problems. Now here we have somebody from the last days of the Royal Aircraft establishment, really, a woman called Sue Adcock, still alive. She was what was known as a flight test observer, and her responsibilities were in aviation medicine, and she was testing and designing high G suits for the RAF in fast fighter jets. And to begin with, she was just going up and testing, but then eventually they let her fly these things a long time before there were any female flight crew in the RAF. She didn't qualify as a fighter pilot, but they let her fly them anyway. She flew Hawks and things. She was also somebody who had a remarkable resistance to the deeply unpleasant effects of the centrifuge tests. She could get up to 9.5 G and still hold a conversation and do maths tests and what have you. Many people can't do that, but it was one of the tests for the Typhoon. And apparently she had to go to the doctors for something or other, and was there being examined, and the doctor said, "What are those bruises behind your knees?" And she said, "Oh, those are from the restraints." And you could see him thinking 50 Shades of Grey, and she had to hurriedly explain that it was to do with the pressure suits and how you have to be strapped in. So coming on to civil aviation, which the Royal Aircraft establishment, when not wholly engaged in wartime activities, spent a huge amount of its time, both between the wars and in the post-Second World War period, assisting the civil aviation industry with testing and development. Those of you of a certain age, and I'm afraid there probably are a few of them in the room, will recall that in the 1950s a number of the Comet aeroplanes crashed disastrously. And so here we have an artist's impression of a comet coming to pieces in mid-flight. This image at the bottom is the one that came down in India. They didn't know what was going on, and so naturally the Royal Aircraft establishment was roped in to try and see if they could find out what was going wrong. Now, gentlemen can virtualise. This one's just for the ladies, because you can never have too much of Jimmy Stewart, in my personal opinion. This is Jimmy Stewart portraying a Royal Aircraft establishment boffin in No Highway in the Sky, based on Neville Shute's novel of the same name, in which you see him testing an aeroplane to destruction by flexing its wings. It was all filmed at the Royal Aircraft establishment. This picture on the left is him sitting in what was known as the Cathedral Hall, where they tested full-scale aeroplanes to destruction. And very nice film it is too, not least for seeing, you know, what it might have been like there at that time. Everybody's drinking in their tea breaks, you know, would you like a nice brandy? Oh, thank you very much, I'll have a double. And smoking fit to bust. It's other times. But this is what the real thing was. The real thing was these two ladies, Kate Maslin again, and Anne Burns. Between them, they devised and introduced the first strain gauges for testing aeroplanes in flight. They weren't sitting in the cathedral, they did. Their test bed was this cabin in the Comet. They were going up in Comet and testing to see what would induce the kind of flexion that ultimately they discovered was the problem with the Comet. There was testing done on full-scale Comets in the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Famously, they immersed it in a tank of water and bent it up and down to find out what and where it was going to break. But a lot of it was done by these strain gauges developed by these two ladies. But Anne Peggy Burns was remarkable in that she not only did that, but she became the world expert in what's known as clear air turbulence. Again, there was a disaster. The Lockheed Electra was one of a number of crashes in the 1960s which appeared to happen in perfect weather and were blamed on almost universally on pilot error of some description. And she discovered that there was a situation which had been known about by the Japanese, but because of the war, that information never got passed along, and then was kind of, they just assumed everybody knew, but nobody did other than them, and they forgot about it. And Anne Burns discovered that there was this thing called clear air turbulence, which is the interaction that can take place when you get two jet streams going in opposite directions at high altitude. And you get turbulence happening between them, but there's no clouds. Normally you think of turbulence in cloudy conditions, but in this condition you're well above the cloud level, and it was assumed there was no turbulence up there, but you can get this condition. And there were a number of crashes. And she found this out and was able to start procedures so that people would understand how to predict it and how to avoid the areas where that might be a problem. She was also a record-breaking glider in her spare time, and another one married to somebody in-house. And now we come right up into the modern era. This lady, Joanna Weber, almost certainly recruited directly by Hilda Lyon. Here is that picture again that I showed you about from the report that Hilda Lyon wrote from her trip to Wolkenrode and Göttingen. And this woman, Joanna Weber, had been working at Göttingen all this time on swept back wings. And she might have been already at Göttingen as a student when Hilda was there as what we now call a postgrad research associate. But when Hilda went in the 1945 trip, Joanna was one of those who was recruited, the only woman to be recruited to the British side. She was an expert in aerodynamics, and when she came to Britain, she was involved in the wing design for the VC-10, the Concorde, and the Airbus A300B. So all planes that we are well familiar with, well up into modern times. She has now passed on as well, though. But it's interesting to see how the links between all these women doing different things in different places at different times have contributed to aeronautical engineering knowledge over the past century and a bit. There is more to know, as ever, I'm always happy to be corrected, informed, pointed at sources of new information, because there's a lot more we could say about women at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Very little of it is published. There's a book about Beatrice Schilling and another one about Anne Burns. Sadly, the author of those two books is now dead. The books are out of print and extremely difficult to find. eBay and Amazon and so on typically don't have them. It would be wonderful if either of those could somehow rather be reprinted, because I know there is interest in them, but very little published about any of these women. So I will finish off with another piece of nice artwork from the early days of airships. Thank you.
Well, that was magnificent, and I know that there are a lot of aeronautical people present, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking Squadron Leader Clive Elam to open the discussion, since he was both an apprentice at the Royal Aircraft Establishment and has worked and is very, very familiar with a number of women aerospace engineers. Clive, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's been a pleasure to have spend another evening with my alma mater. In September 1948, when I arrived at Farnborough to start an apprenticeship, Miss Shilling was pointed out to me, as she was, I think, to all new arrivals, with something that was between awe and reverence, as the lady what did.
Excuse me,
and she
could Clive stand up?
Clive,
We
would you?
can't hear you at the back.
Fred wants to hear your gems of wisdom, and I don't blame him, actually.
I'm not sure that I can actually stand up and survive.
Can you talk up then? Yes.
Yeah, we used to have a travelling mic.
No, I'm sorry, we've slipped up in our relationship with the Science Museum on that point.
Well,
And this seems to be attached. I can't shift it to you, I'm afraid.
yes, I will do my best, John. But I may have to. Oh,
I don't want a disaster here.
I may have to sit down halfway through.
You'll have to turn it round so you can face the other way.
If I can face the audience. I think about there somewhere, yes. In September 1948, when I arrived at Farnborough to start an apprenticeship, Miss Shilling was still in the establishment, as Nina has said, and she was pointed out to me and to all other new arrivals with a mixture of something between awe and reverence. She was easily distinguished at the time because she rode around the establishment on not on the Great Norton that she was sitting on in your picture, but on a 125cc VSA Bantam.
We now have a
Thank you.
microphone. Hold it close.
Is that better?
Yes.
May I resume my seat before I fall over?
They're falling over.
The second thing I would like to offer comment on is that I shared my life with a woman engineer for over 40 years. So far as we could determine, my late wife was the first woman to graduate in aeronautical engineering from Imperial College in 1958. She was, as you so kindly said, of people from my part of the world. She was a Yorkshire woman, born in Bradford, and having shown good deal of mathematical talent at her school, the school decided she ought to go to Cambridge to read maths. And they were most put out when she said, "I'm not going to Cambridge to read maths." And they said, "What do you want to do?" and she said, I would like to go to Imperial College to read aeronautical engineering. At which, being a good girls' school, there was shock and horror set in, and they said, but you will be amongst all those men. To which her response was, so what? On graduating, she came to join me in the design office at Baby Rowan Company in Manchester, where she worked as an aerodynamicist in the initial projects office, investigating such arcane prospects as all sorts of existing aeroplanes being turned into vertical takeoff variants, things that look very much like a Vulcan, but with lifting fans embedded in the wings, which she did. She continued to do this for 3 years, and then had to retire from the scene because my son was on his way. She was out of action for 10 years, domestic freight altogether, and on resuming work, she found her way into further education, and eventually became a civilian lecturer at the Royal Air Force Apprentice School at RAF Halton, where she remained for 16 years, becoming the senior civilian lecturer, and retiring in 1996. Sadly, she died in 1998, whilst in the chair of the local 3A branch. And finally, just as a comment, during my service at RAF Scampton in the 1970s, I had as my senior flight commander one of the few WRAF engineer officers who was a very bright young lass, also graduate of Imperial College, which led to one of the station commanders commenting in an after-dinner speech that I was the only man on the station who was henpecked 24 hours a day. And she married an RAF Phantom pilot, and again had to retire from the scene because of childbirth. But eventually they settled with her husband in Ayrshire, where she proceeded to run her own software for the rest of her life.
This is Suzanne Jones now, Suzanne
Yeah.
Flynn, now living in the Lake District.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Not many of those growing on trees anywhere.
Full marksman, and that
Close friend of mine.
and of mine.
Well, I'll tell her that.
Thank you. That's all I've got to say,
Thank
really.
you for sharing that. That's
Thank you,
fantastic.
Kai. We'll throw it open to the audience. Frank, start.
Thank you. That was super. You mentioned in passing the notion that sort of women could enter aeronautics because there's a new sort of technology, new engineering practice in the sort of 1920s, 1930s. Interestingly enough, in science, at exactly the same period, you have disproportionate numbers of women compared to other traditional scientific disciplines in things like X-ray crystallography and biochemistry. And I sort of just wonder whether there's something in that sort of remark you made in passing about the sort of value of having a sort of completely new set of practices and knowledge base coming through, sort of without that sort of traditional physics or whatever, except with mathematics. I mean, mathematics was sort of pretty well dominated as well.
I would say that if you look at the continuing difficulty we have in this country and in the USA and some parts of Western Europe, in the numbers, the proportion of women in engineering compared to men. It is clearly a cultural thing, and it's, if you look at other countries, and the big examples are probably Turkey, Syria, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the former Eastern Bloc countries. 30, 40, high 40% engineers. And I was racking my brains as to, now with the Russians, it's kind of know why, but with the others I was wondering why, because in some cases there's a Muslim majority countries and you think that's kind of counterintuitive. However, a Turkish academic wrote a very interesting book about this, and her idea, I think is correct, is that these are all countries which either had revolutions in the 20th century or became independent post-colonial countries in the 20th century. And in both situations, you have a new country with new beginnings. Everybody's got to put their shoulder to the wheel. We are a modern country, women do everything here, and by God, we're going to need them because we've got a lot to do. And it's kind of hung on, that culture has remained with those countries. We've never had that. America hasn't. And it's, I can only think that this sort of culture that has been left over from the 18th and 19th centuries is still somehow stuck here. It is still very hard to persuade people to think of an engineer and not to think of a car mechanic. You know, we have a lot to overcome on the cultural barrier front here. And that's why I think that the newer branches of engineering come with less baggage and seem somehow to have been able to continue in that way. Maybe science as well, but that's not really, I'm not so expert in those fields.
Simon, Julia.
Done.
Can I go from the sublime to the ridiculous, if I may put it so? You're about to enter the only house in London with gold-beater's skin.
Oh,
Because when it's not being used for airships, it's being used to wrap around the joints of double reeds, and I'm an oboist.
that's how I bought this.
So you go to Howard's and buy it down, but
Where did I buy it from? Haworth, you're quite
Haworth.
correct. I have the receipt here.
Yes.
It's the only place I could get a little bit of it, not too ridiculously expensive. People are welcome to come up and feel it afterwards. It feels like slightly greasy tracing paper.
And it's the most amazing stuff. I mean, if you buy reeds now, they all come with cling film. But I, in fact, I mean, you know, for all the reasons you said, but actually, you can, you know, with a double reed tied onto a stable, of course, we have to prevent it from leaking. And gold-beater's skin is the perfect thing to prevent it from leaking. So on a teensy-weensy scale, oboe reeds, and I've only just occurred to me this minute because I know quite a lot about airships, never occurred to me.
Well, I didn't get into that, but that's how I bought it from Haworth of London, woodwind instrument specialist.
That's
and it
right.
cost me, I'm afraid, £4, including postage for that peatsy little bit.
Yes, no,
But then I wasn't going to go to a butcher and ask for a bit of cow dung and stuff. I think if I could figure it out myself.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, you could have had some of mine.
Well,
Gentleman back there, yes please.
Were the gas bags enclosed in a tougher sack as such, like?
yeah. Yeah, they were, I mean, the thing I'm talking about was the inner gas envelope, and they were contained within a fabric outer. And even at that, there was considerable difficulty in nearly all airships with rubbing against wires and stays and, you know, beams and what have you, and struts and so on.
Can I ask a question which hasn't been raised and discussed? Equal pay. I know that the Ferranti women programmers were very early beneficiaries of equal pay, which was a rather unusual set of circumstances where Ferranti thought that women made better programmers than men. Is there any evidence that these women were equally paid for their work, or
No.
what's the circumstance?
Well, they were in the civil service, so they were on the civil service women's grades, and that was, you know, that they were kind of stuck with that. And throughout the correspondence, you know, from the 1920s right through, you see year after year of the directors and the departmental heads at the RAE writing begging letters to the Treasury to be allowed to employ more people of any description, to be able to pay people more, to be able to pay some of these women discretionary bonuses in order to keep them, because there was no place for them to be promoted to, and this came up time after time. But then even at that, I think only Frances Bradford, who I've not mentioned here, was ever on something approaching equal pay with a man of her rank. The only exception to that, and this was somebody who by that time was not at the RAE but who worked with them from time to time, was somebody called Ireenie Joy Ferguson, who before the war had been doing technical civil service work in the Air Ministry, went into the Air Transport Auxiliary as a pilot for a couple of years during the war, went back to Ministry of Supply, Air Ministry, and had the remainder of their career in that ministry as a chief experimental officer, writing the likes of these kinds of things, these pilot notes and so forth.
Very rare beasts.
Well,
experimental officers.
they were, because they were more practical than the senior scientific officers, who all had degrees. It's not clear if Ferguson had a degree or not. I've never got to the bottom of that. But the interesting thing about Ireenie Joy Ferguson is that in the 1950s, Joy let it be known to the civil service hierarchy that she required 3 months medical leave to go to North Africa to become a gentleman, and would be returning to work in due course as Jonathan Ferguson. The civil service, to its undying credit, took no particular concern at this, but it was public. It was in all the papers. It was published that Joy was becoming Jonathan, and the press release from the civil service was that the only difference to Ferguson's work was that from being on the women's pay grade, he would now be on the men's pay grade. And at that time, in the late 50s and very early 60s, when this, what was then called sex change surgery and now gender reassignment, was at its very, very earliest days. It was possible before the war, but there's no examples of it in the civil service record. There is an academic at one of the London universities who I think probably is a transgender person themselves, spent ages at the National Archives at Kew going through the pension committee minutes, because that's where it all came to light. People were saying, well, I'm a man, I've been on the men's pay scale, the men's pension system, which retires at 65, I am going to come back as a woman, I need to be on the women's pay scale and retire at 60. And this was all argued out in the pensions committee. And all they were trying to do was to sort out how many people were going in which direction and what it was going to mean for the money. They actually didn't care. But we have to say these were all senior people, well established in their careers, well able to take 3 months off and still be valued to come back. It was remarkable that it went so smoothly then, because only a few years later there was a huge court case where a male-to-female transgender woman called April Ashley caused a colossal fuss in the papers and in the courts, and in a sense that court case set the trans community back decades, because it then took them another 30 years to get back to where they'd been in the 50s, where it was kind of accepted thing. Oh, you're going to do this thing? We just need to make sure the paperwork's right. And it, so it's interesting how these things kind of move around. but no, equal pay in the civil service, not so much. That's the long answer to a short question.
Well, I think we've had a superb evening. We've gone from gender reassignment to 250,000 dead cows and on to the notable fact that Beatrice Schilling was a graduate of what was to become UMIST, which, where I later worked in the same department. We're very proud of her, immensely proud of her, I should add. I think we should thank Dr. Nina Baker for a superb and revealing talk and some great anecdotes, as well as a lovely piece of pioneering research. Nina, a very warm thank you. Thank you. We're going to dinner as usual.